So the two most powerful pieces of evidence for the resurrection are probably the appearances and the empty tomb. And now when it comes to the appearances, there's not much debate. Pretty much everyone agrees. Even unbelieving scholars will grant that the disciples had real experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. That is to say, they didn't just make this up. It just doesn't work to say that they just made it up. They really believed Jesus had been raised, and that was based on their experiences of what they perceived to be appearances of the risen Jesus. And these experiences were so real to them that they were willing to lay down their lives for this belief. Now, some have sought to explain this away by hallucination, but that really breaks down quickly. I mean, if we look at the details that we see in the New Testament, we see, first of all, that almost all of these appearances were to groups, and you just don't have group hallucinations. But also, if we consider the reality of the empty tomb, you take these experiences in the empty tomb and you put them together, it makes a very powerful case for the resurrection of Jesus. But since most will grant, most everyone will grant that the disciples had these experiences, the empty tomb is often where people will go to make a case against the resurrection. Even though most scholars of all stripes will even grant the empty tomb, there are some who argue against it. And so what I want to do is, just from a historical perspective, give some arguments for an empty tomb. So the first is what some have called the Jerusalem factor. Jesus' death, his burial, his purported resurrection, all took place in Jerusalem. And this is also where Christianity got off the ground, right? It didn't happen in some far off place. It happened there at ground zero. And it all hinged upon the resurrection of Jesus. And so, there were many detractors to the Christian faith. It would have been very easy for someone just to go and roll away the tomb and say, hey, look at this rotting corpse. And that would have put an end to Christianity. So I think that the fact that this didn't happen, the fact that Christianity got off the ground there at ground zero in Jerusalem, is evidence for an empty tomb. Now, some in response have argued, well, maybe Jesus wasn't even buried properly in a tomb, but he was just put in a mass grave. This doesn't work for a number of reasons. First of all, we see that the earliest detractors, we see it in the New Testament itself, but then also just within the first couple of centuries of Christianity, we see again and again that defenders of the faith are responding to the claim that the disciples stole the body. Right, so that was the earliest opposition to the resurrection hypothesis, was that the disciples stole the body, which grants that the tomb was empty, right? It shows that there was a need to explain the empty tomb. Now, not many people will give this explanation today because, again, everyone will grant that the disciples really believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and so that doesn't jive with them stealing the body. But that was the earliest claim, and I think that actually shows that there was an empty tomb that needed to be accounted for. Another argument for the empty tomb would be the fact that in the New Testament, we're told that Jesus was buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. That's a lot of specific detail. We have the man's name, where he's from, that he's on the Jewish Sanhedrin. The members of the Sanhedrin would have been well known and documented historically. Certainly, people who were hearing this account or who were reading the gospel account, they could go back and look and say, okay, was this Joseph really a person who was on the Sanhedrin? And they could have tracked it down to see if in fact Jesus was buried in this tomb, and if in fact the tomb was empty. And so if they were just making up this story of the empty tomb, or even of Jesus' burial in the first place, certainly it would not have been a good idea to say that Joseph of Arimathea of the Jewish Sanhedrin buried him, because then they would have quickly been proven wrong. This is a similar line of reasoning to the Jerusalem factor. Right, this could have easily been proven wrong, but it wasn't, because this is in fact what happened. Jesus was buried by this man named Joseph, and so there we have especially good evidence for Jesus' burial, but then also that I think supports the empty tomb as well. And then finally, the discovery of the empty tomb by Jesus' women followers. In the first century, the testimony of women was worth about half of the testimony of men. It wasn't regarded as reliable. Now, hopefully, you know that women are just as reliable as men, but back then that was not accepted. And so, if they were making up this account of the empty tomb being discovered, it wouldn't have made much sense to say that women discovered it, right? That would have hurt the credibility. The reason why they say women discovered it is because women did discover it. That's what happened. And so this is what some have called the Criterion of Embarrassment. It's kind of an embarrassing thing. And so that actually gives us more reason to believe from a historical standpoint that this is actually what happened, that these women followers did discover this empty tomb. And so I think all of these things together help to show that the tomb really was empty. Now that alone doesn't equal resurrection, but when we take the appearances and the empty tomb, I think that makes a very powerful case for the resurrection of Jesus.